I think you have to distinguish when all of these leaders get together occasionally for a top-level summit meeting between those issues which pertain to NATO, the organisation, and for which NATO is responsible, and then the general sort of global big strategic issues that are not immediately in NATO's basket, but which obviously leaders like to discuss when they come together. And if you look at the strictly NATO portion of the story, there's good news on burden sharing. Your correspondent rightly pointed out that President Trump is now giving the European allies credit for upping their defence spending, and he's seeing it as the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. There's good news on NATO facing up to some of the big new challenges. One thing that wasn't mentioned, but which is going to be very significant today, is that NATO will declare that space is a new domain of operations, which it will start looking into. And then NATO is starting to get to grips with some of the big security challenges for the future by coming together around an agreed policy on China. So I suppose for the NATO part, it's good, looking good. I mean, for the part which is beyond NATO, like Syria, where NATO is not on the ground in any kind of operation, the fact that the leaders are meeting and discussing is a good sign. And if they can use NATO more as a political forum for addressing some of these big transatlantic issues, then even if it could generate some headlines in the short run, in the long term, it's all for the good.
You're talking about the challenges externally that NATO is facing, but it's certainly got some internal ones which were made apparent yesterday. Turkey, for example, threatening to veto NATO's Baltic strategy. Is that something that people should be worried about?
Well, it's always a question of quid pro quos when you come to negotiation, particularly on a declaration, and that's been going on in the alliance for a long time. But the fact of the matter is that NATO does have a strategy to defend the Baltic states. Americans and Europeans and Turks are all up there in Poland and the Baltic states with aircraft and troops and ships, and so that defence is pretty solid. Turkey has been holding up the refinement of what is really a contingency plan to make a point, which I think is a valid point, that we are in a 360-degree NATO today, where the south, the southern flank, and Turkey is part of that southern flank, also faces challenges, and the southern flank should be given equal attention in the alliance to the eastern flank. NATO has to be a little bit more balanced in that regard, and I think Turkey is using this to make that particular point, but it certainly won't hold up consensus on collective defence, because Turkey relies upon that collective defence as well.
In terms of balance on the international stage, the alliance was initially set up to be a united force against Russia. Does that need still really exist? And does it not, one might argue, just now perpetuate Cold War divisions, NATO's in existence?
Well, NATO has always adopted a balanced approach to Russia too, which has been based on the one hand defence and deterrence, strong security, and on the other hand dialogue and détente. And some allies, naturally, because geography does count here, will put the emphasis